Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the next episode of Operation Bad Wolf. It's early. I've got my coffee. And that's really good. But on today's episode, I have quite a bit of stuff that I want to try and get done. The more that I can get taken off of my motor today, the more that can go to the parts washer and the parts cleaner so that I can get that stuff ready and prepped for paint. As you can see behind me though, this is my rod change box. And if you've been following the episodes, this probably looks a little different to you than it did before. And that's because I've torn it down a little bit. And I know that this is probably going to make a few of you kind of sad, but I didn't videotape tearing this down. And the reason I didn't videotape it is because I don't feel comfortable enough to explain the things that are going on in this gearbox to you guys while I'm taking it apart. So once I get this all cleaned and everything, I will probably do an overview of what I'm doing to the gearbox. But overall, I don't want to tell you guys to do the wrong thing and steer you down a path that ends up causing some sort of gearbox failure. So for the most part, I'm not going to dive deep into this right now. I might in the later episodes, but for right now, I'm going to hold back on that. But what I'm hoping to get done today is getting the gearbox that's on my motor off, get that remote box off, and then I want to start cleaning up my actual motor and getting it ready for the new paint, which means that I'm going to strip the paint off of the existing block. And I'm also going to need to clean this up so that I can paint this, because I am going to put a protective coat over this aluminum as well as a protective coat over the block itself. So without further ado, let's get into it. All right, so my plan is pretty simple. I've got my engine crane here, and granted, the gearbox is not that heavy. I can lift it by myself. If you can avoid it, it's totally worth it to use a tool if something weighs, over like 50 pounds. Because realistically, you're saving your back and you're saving your body, which is part of what allows you to do these things. You'll thank yourself and it makes the whole job easier. So in this case, I have my engine crane with two straps underneath, nicely secured underneath the gearbox. I'm going to undo all the bolts around the base of the gearbox and lower it down onto the wood blocks that are right here. And then I can pull the engine lift out of the way along with the block itself, and then the gearbox will remain underneath. So pretty straightforward. I'm going to start loosening up these bolts, and let's take and drop this gearbox. All right, now we can wheel the naked block back into the shop and we can start working on this a little bit more. All right, so that pretty much sums up the gearbox removal. I mean, realistically, it's just a bunch of bolts that go around the bottom that sandwich this stuff together. Now, before we start prepping the block for paint and doing a lot of the kind of other fancy stuff that we want to do, we got to take the camshaft out as well as the lifters, because I am putting a new cam in and I'm going to put new lifters in with it. All right, so as you can see, I have my crankshaft perfectly straight up and down here, and that's so that I can get my camshaft and the lifters out. And ordinarily, if you were just going to paint your motor, you could tape this stuff off and you wouldn't necessarily have to do this. The camshaft pokes out the side here. We've got our timing system off, and keep in mind my motor is upside down right now. On the A-series blocks, the lifters can't actually be taken out from the top of the motor. You have to go down underneath, flip the motor over, and take them out from the bottom. So the easiest way to do that is to pull the camshaft out, and you'll want to be careful with this if you're going to reuse it. Mine is in good shape, so I don't want to damage it, and we can set that off to the side. And then what I've found is the easiest way to get these lifters out is to take a small magnet and go down in there, magnetize, and pull it out. Now, if you're going to reuse these, it's important that you keep these in the order that they came out. In my case, I'm not going to be reusing these. I've got a new set coming which will replace those. Now the next thing I want to talk about before I get too far ahead prepping this for paint and everything, specifically this valve right here. Your Minis most likely have a nut right here that's fully closed. It's not adjustable like this. But the last time that I had a failure in my engine in terms of oil pressure, I felt like it would be a good idea to replace this valve, and the reason I did, and we'll take it apart and I'll show you here in just a second, but what this allows me to do is control the oil pressure on my motor. So instead of having a whole bunch of oil pressure all the time, and then as soon as that bypass valve gets stuck open, it lets all that pressure by, this allows me to adjust that and really determine what I want my PSI to be at any given time. It's pretty cool, and they're not super expensive, and in my opinion, they're one of the best things that you can do for your motor. 7 Mini Parts sells these, and I actually think they might be having a sale on them right now, but I'm not 100% on that. But I would check out, I'll put a link to it in the description, and you guys can go over and check that out. But now we've got this undone. I'm gonna pull this out real quick. And so you have a spring, and then at the end of the spring you have a plunger, which I'll show you here in just a second as well. Set that off to the side. And then what you can do is actually reach in here and grab that plunger out, which you can see here. Now this is actually the point of failure when I had my last engine rebuild that I had to do. And what happened is this plunger got a small piece of debris caught here, and it forced it to stay open consistently and allow all the oil pressure to pass out of my motor, thus starving my motor of oil. The benefit of having an adjustable one is that you can change the tension in there. But it's not to say that you can't get another piece of debris stuck up in this, but it's one less thing you have to worry about. But then you can focus on making sure that your engine gets lots and lots of clean oil, which I do by putting a magnet on the bottom of the filter, which collects debris there, as well as changing my oil very regularly to make sure that there's no oil and particulate left behind. All right, so what we're looking at here is the remote box. All right, so I know I said I was gonna prep the motor, but it's kind of crummy outside right now, and I don't want to be out there stripping the motor and everything. But what I can do is get the differential out of my remote box. Now, the reason I'm taking the diff out is because I'm going to be using the final drive gear that's in this diff with my new rod change box. But in order to do that, I need it out of this one. So this one is going to come with, when I sell it, a diff that will have a final drive on it. I'm not quite sure what size final drive it is, but it will be coming off of that rod change box, and it's in pretty good shape. This is the final drive, but there's going to be some mixing and matching of stuff, but ultimately it'll be a U-joint style output shaft coming out of a diff with the final drive that I just held up for you guys. But anyways, I've taken the cotter pins out of these threaded areas here, and I'm going to use a pry bar. I'm hoping that I can hold this in place while I go and loosen this. Let's see here. Well, that's on there really tight. This is going to be quite a struggle. All right, so I got those bolts off, and I have to tell you, that was really difficult. I ended up having to wedge a pry bar down in there. Well, I basically stood on that wrench. I probably could have used a breaker bar, and now that I'm thinking about it, it was probably going to be easier if I had done that. But I've got the nuts out, got the output shafts. They have a small washer in here. Just make sure you don't lose that. Take that off, set it aside, do the same thing for the other side, and now we can start taking apart all this stuff. Now, if I'm completely honest with you, I don't really know how this works. And I haven't had to do a lot of work with this. And by a lot of work, I mean I haven't really had to do any work with this. That said, the differential isn't that complicated. You take these two output covers off, and then you take this cover on the back off, and it should allow me access to that diff. I think I'm going to have to loosen this up so it slides off, or loosen this one up so it slides off. But once I do that, I should be able to get access to the differential, and then we can see some pretty cool stuff. I'm going to lean this on its face here and raise the camera up a little bit so that you can see that, and then we'll start taking all of this stuff apart. Now you can see here I just pulled off some shims, and these shims are to correct the end float on the differential. These generally go on one side, and correct the float one way or the other in order to make sure that your diff isn't floating back and forth too much. In this case, I'm going to set these aside. These will come with the transmission when I sell it, but whenever you do something like this, whenever you change a diff, any of that stuff, you're going to want to re-shim it and remeasure everything during that time. Now, I actually stand corrected, there were shims on the other side too. My understanding was that these were only used on one side of the diff, but I am clearly wrong because it was on both sides of my diff. Alright, so one thing I am going to do with the shift linkage up on the top here is take a Sharpie and draw a line across this so we know where this lined up before. That should help whoever gets this box after me put this back together. Keep in mind, I'm not sure if that's everything you need, but hopefully it will work out for you. Alright, so that should be all of the nuts and bolts. Next up, we just have to kind of coerce this thing into coming apart. That diff certainly was never going to leak because holy crap, I don't know if I was the one who put that on there last or what. But there we have it. The diff cover is off and now we have a nice good look at our differential and our final drive gear. So this actually just lifts out. So I am going to set the gearbox on the ground, bring this final drive and the diff up here where we can work on it next. All right, so here we have it. Our final drive, as well as our races. Actually, that one does not need to come off. This one, however, does. Now, these races are a pain in the butt to get out, and often when you're taking them out, you end up destroying them. It's kind of a common thing, so if you are doing a differential service, you're going to want to have an extra race. All right, we're going to have to move over to the bench vise. All right, that's not quite cooperating. Normally that would come off, but it looks like we're going to have to use a puller tool, which, lucky for me, I have one right here. Hopefully it's long enough. All right, so fair warning if you're doing this on your car, this is one of those jobs that can be a little frustrating, and if you don't have the right tool, it makes it even harder. This tool right here is a bearing pulling tool, and I'm hoping that it pulls it off cleanly. I am not feeling super confident about it, but we'll give it a shot and see how it works. And then if it still is causing us headache, then we'll have to find other methods. And, ladies and gentlemen, that is why I was wearing safety glasses. Now let's try this again and see if we can get the inner race off. All right, so I switched it up and I decided to come over to the diff that came out of the rod change box. I'm gonna take this final drive off for right now. I'm gonna let my other diff sit. That race is not wanting to come off, and so I don't wanna do it right now. I don't wanna fight it. So for right now, let's get this one off. And there we have it. Final drive gear removed. And this is your output shaft as well. So this is one of the many things that's different between my remote change and my rod change box that I've got here. This is for a CV joint. This spline right here is smaller on the U joint, which means that if you wanted to switch from U joint to CV joint, you'd have to replace these output shafts on your differential, which is part of what this whole teardown started as. It's obviously evolved into much more than that, but this is the main reason I took it all apart. So let's set this off to the side, and I'll be waiting for my 4-pin diff to come from Paul Jeffries. And I mentioned him in my last video, but check out his Facebook link. He has been unbelievably helpful throughout this whole process. It should be popping up along the bottom of the screen. Head over there and like his page. He's a really cool guy, and he has incredible knowledge when it comes to classic minis. But anyway, let's get back to the diff. Now, I've set this old gear coming out of the rod box on top of the differential that I've got here, and if we slide it off, that's the smaller gear that I'm going to be going with on my car. And this, I think, is a 2.95. I have no idea what this is, but as you can see, if I put it straight on there, you can't even see the disc behind it. Take it off, and you can see the final drive that I want to use. So I'm going to put this back in the vise, and I'm going to see if we can get it off one more time. Alright, so I've got my final drive off now, and I'll be able to put this on my new diff when it comes in. This race still isn't off. I'll probably bring this to the machine shop and see if they can pull that off or press it off, or I don't know how they do it, but hopefully they can get that off. Since they're going to be washing a bunch of parts for me, hopefully they can just do it all at one time. But regarding this final drive, I'm going to put this back on this diff, and this will be ready, and it can go back in the remote change box whenever whoever gets this is ready to put that back together. Alrighty everybody, that's it for this episode. I know that it was kind of all over the place. I started with the motor and then I moved on to gearbox things, and it's really because I wanted to strip the motor today and get that a little bit more prepped for paint. However, the weather didn't really cooperate, so I ended up having to pivot a little bit. I hope it wasn't too confusing. I tried to edit it together as best as I could. But if you guys have any questions about the things that I did in this episode, feel free to post them in the comments section below. Otherwise, a big thank you to 7 Mini Parts. As always, they are the ones who provide 99% of the parts you see me use in these episodes. So if you guys like what I'm doing, head over, check out their website. The links are in the description below for the parts I used in this episode. And using those links gives me a little kickback, helps me do things on this channel, as well as showing 7 Mini Parts that they are getting traffic from my YouTube channels. Also, it's been a little bit since I mentioned it, but I do have a merch store. It's merch.classicminidiy.com. There are lots of really cool t-shirts and accessories and mini parts on that site that I am selling, and of course all the funds go right back into this channel and making the videos really cool and really exciting for you guys. But anyways, that's it for Classic Mini DIY today. I can't wait until the next Operation Bad Wolf episode, where we're hopefully going to get the motor painted, or at least some of the things painted, prepped, cleaned, getting them ready to get put back together. Because it's tough seeing more and more of my engine come to pieces, I tell you what. But anyways, until next time, enjoy those minis and motor on.